Go. Welcome. Here we are. We're reading Farley Mowat's The People of the Deer, and we're on chapter 4 called The Children. After his first outpouring, France became silent, speaking only in monosyllables and evading the questions that were constantly occurring to me. Perhaps he was ashamed of his outburst on the first night, as a sober man is ashamed of a drunken episode when he has revealed too much of himself to a stranger. Or perhaps he was engrossed only by the delayed arrival of his brother. Each morning he left the cabin to climb the lookout hill near camp, where he spent the hot hours of the spring days staring over the rotting surface of the ice-covered bay to the southeast. Hans was long overdue. Earlier in the spring, he had made a trip to the south end of New Alton Lake, 100 miles away, to rescue a winter cache that had been left on a little islet. Now Hans had only a scant few days in which to make his return, before the ice passed completely from the bay and dog travel would have been no longer possible. On the third morning of our vigil together, it began to rain, and it rained as it did all things in this land, with overwhelming violence. France and I were driven into the leaking cabin. As we sat listening to the sodden drumming of water on the caribou skins of the roof, we both suddenly became aware of a new sound that had insinuated itself into the muffled thunder of the rain. I listened tensely until I recognized it as only the murmur of snow water flowing down above the ice of the river. It was a sound I knew, but there was a changed depth to its voice. The murmur seemed to swell, to become resonant, and then in an instant's time, it was transformed into a heavy-throated roar. The cabin shuddered, and the tin plates on the table slid and rattled as if they were dancing to the erratic rhythm of an earthquake. Heedless of the driving rains, Franz ran outside, and as I followed him, I caught a terrifying glimpse of an immense cake of ice, at least 10 feet in thickness, rearing out of this river, not more than 20 paces from our door. The great cake stood briefly on end like a gigantic tombstone. Then it toppled forward, and as it fell, a gray geyser of tormented water flung itself high above the shifting ice. The river, so long contained, was surging up between the shattered flows, and in a few minutes had climbed the slopes below us and was lifting the debris about the cabin door. I watched the cataclysm through the gray lens of the rain, while the rising waters lapped about my feet. The sound that had first given us warning of what was about to happen now moved up the river like the roll of a giant drum. As it passed, a thunderous and violent cacophony came into being as the great cakes shattered and moved ponderously down toward the frozen bay. The momentum of that movement seemed irresistible. Yet where the river joined the bay, there was resistance, and on a mighty scale. Along its forward edge, the bay ice took the full onslaught of the river flows and shattered with such pressure that the air above the battleground was filled with a fine dust of ice crystals that defied even the down-driving rain. Floe cakes the size of buildings were ground out of existence in mere moments, to be instantly replaced by others, which drove the stubborn barrier of the bay ice slowly backward from the river mouth. At last the bay ice would give no more, and the lumbering pans came down the river and were held. Behind them, the water rose so rapidly that it was soon knee-deep in the cabin, while the river was no longer 15, but 30 feet in depth. Great cakes strayed in the eddies behind the ice dam, and one of them nuzzled the log walls of the cabin as a bull elephant might try his strength against a standing tree. France and I had fled to the ridge, and we were filled with a mounting excitement that gave us no time to worry about the possible loss of the cabin and all our belongings. The dam across the narrow river mouth was steadily enlarging, and it shuddered and rumbled wickedly as a constant succession of new blocks crashed into its upstream side and were thrown high to reinforce the crust. And then, when it seemed that nothing could save the cabin from the insane river, the dam began to give. Moving as an entity, it slid out over yet unbroken ice of the bay. 10,000 tons of obstacles slowly gave way before the power of that unleashed river. The dam dissolved so easily that it gave the impression of a gentle and effortless decomposition. but the measure of its true ferocity appeared when a single cake of ice, the size of a small house, was suddenly flung clear and like a curling stone was shot for nearly half a mile across the creaking ice of Windy Bay. Spinning over that black, rotting surface, the great cake came to rest at last against the rocks of a small reef, and there it sat through the succeeding days until the sun at last destroyed it. While it remained, it was a fitting token of the forces that the land contains. Both France and I were so engrossed in the sound and fury of the battle that we did not hear the approaching dogs as they climbed over the ridge. Not until the wooden sled had rasped over the gravel and stood beside us did we see it. The dogs sat back in their traces, and I guessed that the slim boy who stood beside the leader was Hans. Before I had time to receive more than a brief impression of his shadowed face, two bundles erupted from the sled, and one of those took form as a bounding mite of fur-clad child who rushed upon Franz and flung itself ecstatically into his arms. The second bundle detached itself from the nondescript baggage and came over to us with a little more restraint, stopping abruptly as it saw me standing there. This was a boy, 13 years of age, clad in deerskins. He stood awkwardly beside Franz, and his smile grew until his upper lip curled up over his flattened nose, almost obscuring it from view. His big, even teeth glistened at me, and I stared back at him in complete fascination, for I saw that these were children of the people I had come to find. The little girl in Franz's arms was chattering and squirming, unable to contain her pleasure at seeing the man again. And as for Franz, there were tears in his black eyes. At length he put the child down, and I saw that she was no more than 5, and small even for that age. She joined the boy, and for the first time she noticed me. Her exuberance vanished at once, leaving her like a small graven image on the hill. "Kuni," Franz said, pointing to her, and "Anno Tilek," pointing to the boy. It was a skimpy introduction, but I had to be content with it for the moment. And as we trooped down the hill to the cabin to assay the damage and clean up the mess, I wondered if Kuni could be Franz's child. The sight of me had made the child shy enough, but on Hans, my presence placed an intolerable restraint. He had long since withdrawn so far within himself that he could barely suffer even the rare contacts with his brother Franz. With me, white and an incomprehensible stranger, Hans' withdrawal was complete. He would speak no words to me at all, but sat alone in a dark corner of the cabin, staring at me as he might have stared at some dangerous denizen of his own bleak land. His skin was dark, much darker than his brother's, and it was stretched too tightly over the narrow, fragile bones of his thin face. His eyes were empty things, blank, still depths that shifted from my face to no more than the eyes of a trapped fox shift from the face of an approaching nemesis. But the shyness of the children was, after all, only the shyness of children. In a little while, they were hustling about the cabin, evidently quite oblivious of me as they traded muted grins with one another. Anno Tilek quickly got a fire going in the wet stove, while Kuni, that minuscule model of a woman, ran to the river's edge, got water, and in a few minutes had a brew of tea ready for us all. After it was poured into the tin mugs, she made herself comfortable on Franz's knee and proceeded to roll a competent cigarette. Franz gave her a light, and she smoked happily while he crooned to her in the manner of a father talking to his child. And now my curiosity could be contained no longer. "Franz," I said, "is she yours?" Franz nodded slowly, though he did not look up at me. "Yes," he replied, and his voice was almost hostile and very different from the friendly voice he had used to me before. "Yes, she's mine. I found her out there in the north, and she's all mine." There was a positiveness, almost a fierceness at the end, as if he was daring me to argue with his right to this incredible child. Then, surprisingly, and with no further prompting, he began to tell me something of the finding of Kuni and her brother Anno Tilek, and later I was to hear more details from the Eskimos themselves. Some 60 miles due north of Windy Bay, across the sudden plains and gravel ridges, there is a nest of little lakes, huddled close up against the banks of the river we call Kazan, but which is properly Inuit Key, the river of men. Inuit is the people's own name for their race. Translated, it means simply mankind. The term Eskimo is not used by them, but is a tag applied by the Indians, meaning eaters of raw meat. The waters of the Little Lakes flow into the Inuit Queue, not far from its beginnings at Lake Enadaya. And for some centuries, this little group of lakes and the surrounding little hills have been the center of the inland culture. The people spread up and down Inuit Queue until their camps stood at each lake and river in the rolling land. They called themselves Ihalmiut, which means the other people, as distinct from those Eskimos who lived on the coast and possessed a sea culture. In all the time that the Ihalmiut have known the land and roamed its endless spaces, the little lakes that lie beside the wide Kazan exercised a special attraction. So it was natural enough, when the tide was turned against them by powers greater than even those the barons know, when plague and starvation struck their blows against the camps, that as the Ihalmiut retreated, they should fall back upon this place. By the year 1940, the last of the outlying camps had been broken. Those few of the people who survived the dissolution of the inland race returned to live once more as their ancestors had before them. About Utuk, Hallow, and Kakumi lakes under the Little Hills. That place became the last stronghold held by living men throughout the land, and it was under siege. It was a fortress without walls, with only the impalpable defenses of a fading will to live could raise against the overwhelming weight of the grim siege which had been laid upon them. The enemies were many, but foremost in their ranks were famine and diseases, and these were both strangers to the land, and so were more frightful than the elemental antagonists that the Ihalmiut had long learned to circumvent. By late autumn of 1946, the remnants of the people were clustered about the bleak shores of the Little Lakes to stand off the never-ending sallies of these enemies as best they could. And there's a note here that says, during the summer of 1947, 18 Ihalmiut men, women, and children died of a disease that was probably diphtheria. Among the people at that place, there was the family of Anglialak, and in his tent lived his mother, who was very old, his wife called Iktuk, and his 3 children, Kuni, Anotilek, and Pama. Iktuk was a good mother to her children and a good wife to her husband, though her strength was often drained away by long coughing spells, which ended only when her bright blood dyed the white fox furs she held against her mouth. Anglialak was a good hunter, yet his efforts were too often brought to nothing, for his old gun could not bring down its game when there was no charge of shot, no powder for its long brass cartridges. As for the old woman, she had outlived 300 younger members of her race, and now she waited, almost impatiently, for the erratic glance of death. Each winter she did not hope to see the spring, and yet each spring she lived to see another winter come. Kuni and Anotilek were but small children still, though Anotilek was old enough to go with his father on the long hunting trips that so often ended with no more than tales of vanished game with which to fill the bellies of the family. Kuni, at 4 years of age, was already deeply serious about her duties as a woman of the camp. She helped her old grandmother to gather willow twigs for fuel, or else drew water from the lakes, or watched the cooking fires when her mother had bled too freely from the mouth and could no longer stand. The igloo of Anglialak stood on the north shores of Utak Kumanik, meaning Utak's lake, and near it stood 3 other camps. On other lakes within a few miles of Anglialak, there were 8 more igloos, and these completed the short roster of homes of the surviving people. In the late winter of 1946, Anglialak and his neighbor Utak went together on a hunting trip. for even then the food at the igloos under the little hills was growing scarce. The two men took only one sled, pulled by 3 dogs, for dog feed was also scarce, and they traveled southward to France's cabin. In all that broad sweep of land they saw no deer, nor yet the tracks of any deer, and they were frightened men. By chance, France was at home when they arrived, and the 2 visitors stayed overnight with him. In the morning they departed, carrying with them the few food supplies that France had been able to spare from his own scanty stocks. But after they had gone, France thought about the things they had told him, and in his mind there was a mixed foreboding. He knew that the camps of the Inhalmiut must be nearly empty of deer meat, for he knew that the fall kill had been a meager one. And on his own most recent trips through the Inhalmiut land, he had missed several deer carcasses, which he had cached the previous autumn for dog feed. He was aware that this meat must have gone into human bellies. He was also aware that the people do not steal unless death has come close enough to make a mockery of morals. On his midwinter visit, Utuk and Anglielac had told France the deer had left the land, and that unless the spring came early, the people too would be gone before the warm suns brought the deer back again. France had listened to this prophecy, and in his heart, anger almost outweighed pity. It was an anger that he should feel a duty and a responsibility towards these savages, and an anger that they should be so foolishly improvident, failing to look to and prepare for the distant future as he, a white man, did. There was anger, too, that they had robbed his cache, and so made it more difficult for him to travel around the traplines on which his livelihood depended. And yet, perhaps the thing which angered the young trapper most of all was the insistent feeling that his very presence in the place had helped to bring about the fatal misery of the people. His father and the other traders who had once bought furs from the Ihalmiut had shown the people that pursuit of fox pelts was more desirable than pursuit of meat. And so in a few decades, the people had learned to neglect the caches of good meat, which they had been used to making every fall. Instead, they learned to trap the white fox and to trade the pelts for flour, shells, and guns. As far as the Ihalmiut could discern, it was a satisfactory change, for they were able to meet their simple needs with much less labor after the traders came. But when trading ceased to pay the high profits always required of it, the great company withdrew its post, and the new way of life that had been taught to the people in their innocence now became death. Men who were once great hunters of the deer had become instead great hunters of the fox. But men cannot eat fox pelts. The people could not change their ways again. Surely, they thought, if we trap fox this winter and take the pelts south, we shall find the trader has returned. But when the traders traveled south, the trading post stood empty and decayed as it had stood the many hungry years. The traders came, stayed briefly while their profits warranted, then left the land, abandoned it, and thought no more of the destruction they had wrought. France lived there still, and he could not drive out the hidden knowledge of the fault. Perhaps it was because of this that when Utuk and Anglielac went almost empty-handed back to the little hills, France thought of them almost with anger in his heart. The winter months dragged by, and there came no more cries for help. At last, early in March, France traveled northward to the Ihalmiut camps and stayed a day in the igloo of old Hekwa. Here, France ate his share of the communal food as he had always eaten it, but that share did not even take the edge off his healthy appetite, and he quickly made his excuses and left the camp. He traveled north to his most distant trapline and once again found that many of the meat caches had been robbed by men. It was mid-March, and Anglielac had returned from a futile hunt during which he carried no gun, but only a crude bow that had served him little better than a toy serves a child. For the men of the Ihalmiut had forgotten how to make cunning bows of horn during the long years when they had no need of bows, and the bright guns and shells were to be had in return for pelts. Anglielac returned to the tent, bringing with him 2 partridge, and these winter-starved birds were to be all the food that 5 people and 3 dogs would have till the time came when many of them would have no further need of food. For a month before that final hunt of Anglielux, there had been no more than a mouthful of food for each person on each day, and this hunt had been a last desperate effort to halt the slow attrition of the gut. The hunt had failed, as it was bound to fail, and now the course of things followed an inevitable pattern which the hunter could no longer break, no matter how he tried. Death was upon the camp, and all that the people could do was to channel the approach of death so that the least important of the living might go first. There was no mention of the problem, for none was needed. While Anglieluk still lived, there was still hope. But should he, the hunter, die, then the family must perish, even though the deer returned in numbers to the little hills. Next to him stood the children, Kani, Pama, and Anotilik, who were the visible expression of the Ilhalmiat's waning will to live. Behind the children were Aituk, wife, mother, and source of new life. Yet her work was nearly done, for the children were old enough to live without her aid. Then came the dogs, the precious dogs, the 3 survivors of a once good team. These 3 scrawny things were treasures and irreplaceable. Mobility was their potential in the family, and without their power to move across the frozen land, not even a great hunter could survive for long. That was the family then, except for the old woman. Ipitna, what was her place? Nothing more secure than the niche that love and filial affection could ensure for her. And these emotions die readily enough when hunger closes its inexorable jaws. On the night after Anglieluk's return with the 2 birds, the old woman did not sleep. It was her time, and she had waited for it through too many starving years. She had looked forward with a hard relief to death, and this night her seeking ended in a wall of snow. Yet now it was time. Fear rose within her. The fear that was so strong in the old, and which makes the terror of young men in danger look pallid and a sham. It was not long before the members of her family took refuge from their bellies' agony and sleep. But the old woman sat on and stared unseeingly over their quiet forms. She heard the whispers of little Kuni and the uneasy mutters of the man, her son. But most clearly did she hear the whisper of the sand-like snow as the never-ending winds drove it along the polished curve of the igloo's dome. The harsh rustle filled her hearing until she was no longer conscious of the little human sounds. The snow noise rose in gradual ascension, and as it grew, so grew her fear of death. The long night was nearly over when the skeletal guardians of the passageway, the dogs, lifted gaunt heads and cowered against the snow blocks to leave the passage free for her, and the old woman passed out of the igloo into the darkness. The ground drift of driving snow enveloped her, and the darkness grew about her. She stood naked, but for her fur trousers, and now she loosened these, and she slipped soundlessly into the drifts. The wind whined like a beast in pain, and the darkness drew about her frail and tortured form. When morning came, no one in the family spoke of her. Not even the child Kuni made reference to the missing face. But later, when the brief half-light of day was upon them, Anglieluk went out alone into the snow, and he stood facing the wind with his amulet belt wound tightly about his waist. And he spoke the words that he had learned as a child in the great and populous camps of the people. He spoke the phrases that he had been taught to say over the newly dead. This was mid-March. It was the time when the days grew slightly longer and when the eternal winter winds unusually drop and die away for days on end. Yet on this year, the winds forgot their place and mounted steadily until the whole world that was the Barrens became a single roaring wind without cessation.
Sorry to interrupt, but we have a group starting at 1.
And what time is it now?
1 o'clock.
Okay, well, we'll have to stop there then. Yep. We're in the midst of chapter 4, page 42. Okay.
Well, thank you, Steve.
Yeah. It was a long chapter.
And the guy's name is Farley Moore.